Polish Musings. In this episode, we'll be examining Mencius, the greatest philosopher in the Confucian tradition after Confucius himself. So now the question can rightfully be asked, who was Mencius? Mencius was another one of these itinerant Confucian scholars who wandered around during the Warring States period and attempted to essentially improve rulers, to bring about a Confucian style of order which would see reciprocity between the emperor and the people, and generally an end to the state of confusion brought about by the constant competition of different states. He was born around about 372 BC in Shandong province, or where is now Shandong province, in the state of Zhao. But he was only around about 30 kilometers from Khufu, or Confucius's birthplace. Now, very early on, his father died, and it's stated that his mother played a very important role in his early life, shaping him towards education and towards a life of the scholar. And for this reason, Mencius' mother is remembered as one of the most important female figures in the Confucian tradition, but also within Chinese early history. Supposedly, he studied with Confucius's grandson, Zisi, and then he also served in the Jixia Academy in the state of Qi from around about 319 to 312. He ended up disappointed at his failure to effect change in this contemporary world when he went around preaching his doctrines and his ideal conception of what Confucianism was to the people and to particularly the rulers, and ended up retiring from public life, eventually dying in 289 BC. So in some ways his life also mirrors that of Confucius, although he was certainly more successful in terms of gaining posts and gaining a position in the Jixia Academy. He sees himself as a bit of a failure. And it's from this perspective we should also see Mencius as someone who idolizes Confucius. He himself doesn't see himself as the progenitor of a new tradition or putting a twist on the teachings of Confucius, but merely as someone who is attempting to clarify the true meanings and the true teachings of the great sage. Key to understanding Mencius's philosophy is understanding his conception of human nature. Mencius sees humans and all animals as sharing in the same base desires for food, shelter, sexual pleasure, and gratification. But he sees humans as being inherently different. He refers to the mind or heart as being that thing that sets humans apart from the animal and inclines them towards the good, inclines them towards thinking. He refers to the five senses as being those subordinate actors to what he would call the heart or the mind in the body itself, and that he does not cling to the senses or cleave to those pleasures of the flesh, but rather to that sort of rationality of the mind. And in that way, we see very interesting parallels with Platonic and then Cynic thought in the Greek tradition. So if we have this rationality which puts humans apart from animals, in Mencius's philosophy, what is the purpose of this rationality? For him, it's the idea of moral thinking. He sees the very act of thinking as moralizing. Once again, it's separating those who are good and those that are bad. He sees the bad person as the unthinking person. Once again, very interesting echoes of Platonism, once again organic and indigenous to its own context. Very interestingly, though, I don't necessarily want to draw too close a line between Platonism and Confucianism, particularly in Mencius. You need to remember that there doesn't have that same sort of mind-body duality that exists within the Platonic tradition. Rather, within the Chinese tradition, within Confucianism, mind and body are seen as a single thing, a single organism. And rather, it's the fact that a defective or a non-thinking person is immoral because there is that aspect of their mind which is a part of their entire body which defines it as wrong. Now, Mencius has discussed this idea of humans as being innately inclined towards good. He's also talked about the idea of humans as being rational as opposed to animals, which are driven by pleasures and senses, although humans, once again, do share that aspect of their nature. So, what is the tendencies of the mind, as Mencius would say, which drive humanity towards goodness? He sees four which are key: shame, courtesy and modesty, right and wrong, and compassion. Compassion for Confucius is exemplified in what he sees as humans' innate understanding of suffering on others and a natural tendency to avoid it. He simply states in a passage that suppose a man were all of a sudden to see a young child on the verge of falling into a well. He would certainly be moved to compassion not because he wanted to get the good graces of the parents, nor because he wished to win the praise of his fellow villagers or friends, nor yet because he disliked the cry of the child. He points to this idea that we will act instinctively out of the benefit or for the benefit of others, without even thinking about the necessary secondary or tertiary consequences. For him, this altruistic nature within, or this altruistic bent within the nature of humanity, points towards an innate level of goodness. For Mencius, the aspect of shame within the human mind is important because it pushes us towards both fulfilling our duties and improving ourselves. For him, he even states that great is the use of shame to a man. He who indulges in craftiness has no use for shame. If a man is not ashamed of being inferior to other men, how will they, being their equal, have anything to do with him? He's stating here the idea that unless we look upon other moral exemplars in our lives or in history and are moved to emulate their performance, which is something that's brought on by, in his words, shame, then there is no real sort of motivation towards any sort of self improvement along the Confucian model. Courtesy and modesty are important within Mencius's conception of philosophy because they sort of act as the bounds, the ritual pathways by which people would interact with each other and yield precedence to others. It was basis of a set of rules of conduct that allowed for polite society to exist, and as such, it would curb natural self-seeking tendencies and allow the more altruistic aspects of human nature to bubble to the surface. And it's a clear distinction, however, between morality and self interest that is important as almost a cornerstone of Confucian moral theory. So it's really the requirement for courtesy and modesty which leads to the elaborate rituals and rites of the court of the emperor that is required to enable this moral theory to flourish. Finally, for Mencius, the heart of right and wrong is really a twofold significance. It's firstly the ability to differentiate between right and wrong, but it's also the what he sees as the innate human inclination to privilege rightness over wrongness. For him, it's the fact, well, at least it's his idea and his belief that humans are all inclined towards the good over the evil. And in this way, he sort of sees, and he really bases his entire moral and philosophical theory upon this cornerstone of moral goodness at the heart of human nature. So, if Mencius has based his entire philosophy upon this idea of innate goodness within human nature, then how does he deal with the exceptions? How does he deal with the psychopaths, the tyrants? Well, Mencius says, and it's important to remember as well that despite what Mencius says, that a Confucian philosophy that isn't based upon an inherent goodness within the human spirit is possible. In fact, one of the philosophers we'll look at later, Kunze, is actually very famous for having established an entire theory based around human nature being evil, and that the Confucian moral theory is there to essentially restrain the darker aspects of the human spirit. But Mencius completely discounts this. His entire system of thought is based upon humans being naturally good. And he explains it away by suggesting that humans are like a mountain covered in trees. But when the villagers come every day hacking down the trees, carrying them off for lumber, for firewood, the mountain itself appears to be bald. It's just a rocky outcrop, not covered in vegetation and greenery. And it's easy to imagine that the mountain itself is always bald and is always in that manner. But it's really the ongoing craft of the villagers going and stripping away the lumber, the innate goodness which is essentially sprouting out of the fertile soils of the mountain, that makes it take on this bald, or in his idiom here, his this evil appearance. And so really, he's discounting the idea that people are evil at birth, they're evil by nature, but rather that by circumstance and by the sort of situation they're put in and the choices that they make, they take on an evil aspect that is in sort of dissonance with their innate nature. And if they were to be corrected, and if they were to make choices that took them down the good path, once again they could be covered in the glorious greenery that is native to their very nature. So I talked a little bit about the analogy of the mountain back there, because it does bring out this and tease out this interesting aspect of Confucianism, which was heavily criticized by Mencius, which I discussed in a previous episode. That idea of fatalism. It's the idea that the Ruist or Confucian school were fatalists, that they believed that we should pursue these rights, we should pursue this moral good, but at the end of the day, all is as heaven wills, and if it occurs, it occurs, and if it doesn't occur, it doesn't. And it's just it's dangerous to discuss this conception of fatalism as well, because there's obviously an underlying tension within this Western discourse we're having here because of traditional stereotypes of fatalism within Asian thought. However, it's not wrong to suggest that the Confucians, including Mencius, do have an ideal of fatalism within their philosophy. They believe that things such as wealth, victory, glory, birthplace, etc., those are all outside of the domain of our control. They are either granted or taken away by heaven. There's nothing that we can do so as to control whether or not we're born into the right family or meet up with the right people or have the right company growing up. But they also believe, sort of like in a soft fatalism, they still believe that it's the importance of those moral choices that an individual makes that sets them either down the path of good or evil. And Mencius in particular focuses upon this kind of decision-making importance within his moral philosophy. The idea that it's up to the individual, it's up for the ruler, but also the individual person to make their choices and take themselves down the path of being a good person in line with their own nature. Now, Mencius is obviously steeped in the sort of pre-scientific and local scientific knowledge of his day, and people in China in this classical period had a conception of bodily energy and life force being motivated by the idea of qi, this internal energy. And there are two kind of thoughts as to whether or how this qi functioned. For some, it was the idea that qi was innate. It started at birth and you had a certain reservoir which you then expended over your life. But then for others, qi was something that could be restored and could be drawn up from others or from the world or through certain actions. And so there was sort of a conflicting scientific, metaphysical, medical conception of how bodily energy worked. And in one sense, it was the idea that you need to sort of stopper up the holes and prevent your qi from leaking out. Whereas on the other side, people believe that you needed to find ways to replenish the reservoir, sort of to gain those aspects or use those potions or alchemy, maybe sort of found in that later Taoist tradition with some of the pursuits of alchemy and immortality in that sort of realm, that kind of conception. Now, Mencius draws upon this, but he fundamentally links the idea of the individual's chi as being linked to the chi of heaven. It's this idea of the chi of the mountains and the seas, the idea that when one is in accordance with what is morally right, one's own personal chi is connected to this greater whole. And so, for Mencius, morality and being a moral person and being one with one's own nature, and then as such being at one with nature, is essentially the cornerstone and the most important action that any individual can take, whether they be as ruler, advisor, or subject. Now turning from the metaphysical and ethical philosophy of Mencius, it's time to turn to that important aspect of his thought which would have an influence upon later Chinese political thought. What we need to understand is that for Mencius, the centrality of the state was based upon the individual people, not upon the ruler. So we see a distinct line between later legalist philosophy, which really focuses on maximizing the ruler's power and control, and this sort of later Confucian philosophy of Mencius, where it's really focused upon benefiting the people of the empire or of the kingdom. Mencius himself says, "The people are of supreme importance. The altars to the gods of earth and grain come next. Last comes the ruler. When a feudal lord endangers the altars to the gods of earth and grain, he should be replaced. When the sacrificial animals are sleek, and the offerings are clean, and the sacrifices are observed at due times, and yet floods and droughts come, then the altars should be replaced." So yes, ritual is of importance here. There's still that focus upon the traditional Ruist ideas of the classics of following the Zhao dynasty and the ways of the forefathers and the ancestors, but also a recognition that the people themselves are of prime importance, and that it's not for the emperor's own whim that he rules, but rather for the people that he serves. What does it mean then, in this context, to be a worthy ruler? Mencius harps on again and again about the idea that the most fundamental aspect that a ruler can take is to align themselves morally with the way, to be a morally good person. He repeatedly denounces the idea of seeking glory or riches, or even attempting to extend or benefit the state through conquest or through warfare in particular, but just even the pursuit of profit or riches he sees as beneath the true way, which is to just act morally correct. For him, he states of those advisors going around the Shi who were pushing themselves as those who could benefit their princes, and I quote, "Those who are in the service of princes today all say, I am able to extend the territory of my prince and to fill his coffers for him. The good subject of today would have been looked upon in antiquity as a pest on the people. To enrich a prince who is neither attracted to the way nor bent upon the benevolence is to enrich a che, or someone who is bent upon destruction and evil." So really, Mencius is turning away from these materialistic conceptions of what it means to be good. He even goes so far as to suggest that someone who is not aligned with the way themselves is really devoid of the position of ruler, and as such not protected by those aspects of the moralistic way. King Shan of Qi asked of Mencius, "Is it true that Tang banished Che and King Wu marched against the Chao?" "It is so recorded," answered Mencius. "Is regicide permissible?" asked King Xuan. "He who mutilates benevolence is a mutilator. He who cripples righteousness is a crippler. and a man who is both a mutilator and a crippler is an outcast. I have indeed heard of the punishment of the outcast child, but I have not heard of any regicide. Here, Mencius is really pushing home kind of this conception that exists within broader and later Chinese general thought of the mandate of heaven. The idea that, well, actually an ancient idea stretching back to the Zhao after they had replaced the Shang, that when a ruler is no longer morally or ethically or ritually fit to be the ruler of the Middle Kingdom, they should be replaced. And it's almost a call to action in some regards. So finally, we turn to the aspect of war. So Mencius has already talked about this idea of, the necessity to overthrow the morally bankrupt ruler. So we've also seen, however, in earlier Confucian philosophy and in Confucian philosophy more broadly, there is disdain for warfare. Mencius himself sort of echoes this same line of thought. He states that warfare is wrong. He believes that it is deleterious in its effects and that it brings about harm to the people. However, he believes that warfare as a form of punishment is something that is permissible within the way. It should be a last resort, but for him, the idea that someone who is acting in a morally incorrect manner, another state, another usurper, maybe even another king, should be punished, and that warfare is a permissible method of doing this. And for Mencius, this isn't really even warfare in a true sense. He sees it as a penalty. How can there be warfare between an unequal and a someone who is on the moral righteous way and someone who is an inferior who has been essentially violating morality and turning away from heaven? In his idea, this is merely the punishment of the inferior by the superior. Mencius also goes to, a small degree. He doesn't spend a large amount of time, but he does go to a small degree to criticizing his contemporaries. In particular, he targets ideas of egoism, the ideas of Mozart, and also the ideas of the agriculturalists. So he targets egoism, this idea of essentially a selfish solipsism, the idea that only I matter and that only my values, which are relative to myself, matter to me. Sort of targeting the way in which it undermines society, and that it, in his mind, undermines the good aspect that is for him rather obvious within human nature. However, when it comes to attacking Mozart, it's slightly different because he's now dealing with another philosophy which it does sort of propound the idea of innate goodness, but also that idea of universal love, love which should be undifferentiated between all people. And for Confucius, at least for Mencius in this Confucian tradition, he sees this as abhorrent because it undermines the filial bonds within the family, which lead in that great chain up to the emperor, and as such undermines the entire ideal of society and the glue that makes society work. Now, finally, the agriculturalists, a much smaller school, which sort of push this idea that each individual should be completely self-sufficient, that everyone should be working the fields, and that the emperor themselves should be living a very frugal lifestyle, working the fields, and completely self-sufficient. He attacks them as being idealistic utopians who don't really understand reality of how an economy works. So for him, he attacks them, suggesting that they themselves are hypocrites because even though they state that they're completely self-sufficient, they then have to barter and trade grain for iron goods and for pottery, and that in the same way, statecraft, which is a great trade, a great profession. As long as the emperor themselves isn't overly enriching themselves, is just taking what is justly their wage, being paid to them by the subjects for whom they are serving. He sees that there is no wrong in this. So, in conclusion, why should we care about Mencius? Mencius is, well, at least in his own estimation and the estimation of his later contemporaries, but also successors and descendants, he is the second greatest philosopher within the Confucian tradition. I would argue that in some ways he is definitely more clear than Confucius. His writing is much easier to understand, and he ends up shaping the Confucian tradition down a very specific trajectory. I'll talk about Kunze in a later episode, looking at some of the internal tensions that exist within this very early stage of Confucianism in the classical period. But it's really Mencius's ideal of what Confucianism should be, or at least the later interpretation of what Mencius meant by what Confucianism should be, which goes on to influence the second Han dynasty, the dynasty that comes after the Qin, and which is that formative power within the very early imperial period for the Chinese. Thank you for watching this episode of Foolish Musings. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, or you can follow me at my blog foolishmusings.com.